lecture series supported by a gift from the Moritz Family Foundation. I'm Liliana Langua. I'm the director of the Center for Child and Family Wellbeing. And our goal is to bring opportunities for evidence-based information and supports for families, children, and parents, the providers who work with them to grow and learn along with us. And our public lecture series is one way that we do that. Before we get started tonight, I'm hoping you'll join me in a land and labor acknowledgement. We ask that you join in reflecting on the lands on which the University of Washington exists and acknowledge the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples who have lived here for all of memory. University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the shared lands of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We offer our respect to the caretakers of these lands and honor their connections to the land. We also acknowledge the enslaved peoples bought and sold into forced labor, as well as the descendants of the victims and survivors of the transatlantic slave trade. We recognize the painful histories of white supremacy that persist today in our racial realities and privileges at this university and in our communities. We invite all to commit to dismantling racism and oppression where we live and work. Thank you for joining me in that acknowledgement. Now it is my true honor and pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest tonight, Dr. Denese Shervington. She has so many titles, past and present, and I couldn't always sort through what she's still doing, which is a lot, and what she was recently doing. So I'm just saying it all. Denese Shervington, Dr. Denese Shervington is the chair of psychiatry and behavioral medicine at Charles Drew University School of Medicine. She's also the director of the Youth Mental Health Academy Mentorship and Youth and Family Course at the Child Mind Institute. She's a scientific board member at the Center for Society of Mental Health, or she has been, I don't know if you still are, for King's College in London, and assistant dean of graduate medical education. She has also a master's degree in public health and population studies and family planning. She has a remarkable intersectional career in public health, clinical, and academic psychiatry. After Hurricane Katrina, she created a post-disaster emotional recovery and resilience division at the community-based nonprofit public health organization that she founded, the Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies. She's also held academic appointments as clinical professor of psychiatry at Columbia University and Tulane University in New Orleans. She's also served as the Deputy Assistant for Population Affairs at the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C. And this is the abridged list of everything she's done. In 2018, she received the Award for Excellence in Service and Advocacy from the American Psychiatric Association. And she also has received the Jeanne Spurlock Minority Award from the American Psychiatric Association. It goes on, but my favorite part of her, she is the author of numerous papers in peer-reviewed journals addressing health disparities and social determinants of health, resilience in underserved communities. And then at the end of her bio, she writes she's the mother of 2 magnificent children and 3 now amazing grandchildren. So please help me welcome Dr. Denese Shervington.
Am I using this? No, okay. Can you all hear me? And all of this is because I'm old.
You just keep.
Yeah, it's all because, what am I trying to say? I'm old and have wanted to be of service in my life. I thank you for welcoming me. And so I want to welcome you. Whatever your race, you're welcome. However you identify with your gender, please feel welcome here. Your sexual orientation, your age, your immigration status. This evening, I'm going to be discussing some very challenging topics because it has to do with oppression, racism. It's difficult. I'm not going to stay there. I'm hoping we can journey through. I also have 2 slides with lynching, if that is going to be problematic for, can you hear me? I will let you know when the slides are coming up, and if it's problematic for you to see the slides, please feel free to close your eyes. I would also, though, want you to think about if it's problematic for you when this is like almost 100 years ago. Yes. So maybe I should I start over? Could you hear me? Okay. So if it's hard visually, I totally understand. I'm not here to traumatize anyone, but this is a talk on working through trauma. So I have to stay in that space and get out of it. So close your eyes. I'll tell you when the slides are coming. But I'm going to ask you, if you close your eyes or you keep them open, this is 100 years later. Think about 100 years before, when this was the reality of African Americans. I don't know if any of you have been to the Lynching Museum. It's full of pain, but it's the reality that some people live with. And I was born in Jamaica, moved to the United States at 16. I've just hit my 70s. I'm very much identified as African American. My children, we've all been in the Black struggle. So a lot of my reference points are that, but I hope to welcome everyone. I'm going to call on my ancestors. I'm going to ask them to be present with me, because this is really difficult. It's hard to talk about pain. It's hard for you to hear, and it's even harder for me to bring it out. But I feel I must do this. So I'm going to call on Harriet Tubman. She made 19 visits to free slaves, oftentimes with guns pointed at her. I'm going to call on Nanny the Maroon in Jamaica, help slaves to escape up into the mountains, and they fought the British off for a long time. I'm going to call on, this is not my ethnic group, but I connect with all peoples in the world. So as was referenced, the indigenous people here last week, I was in New Orleans, an amazing performance by a Black indigenous singer, Martha Redbone. Don't know if any of you know her. And she brought the pain of her people on the Trail of Tears and those who were in boarding schools. She brought them in that space and she honored their existence. And I also want to call on the energy of the migrant populations that I do some work with in New Mexico, the beauty and the brilliance of these folks who are trying to find a better life, running away, and the traumas that they must go through. I hope that what I bring ultimately is the importance of us all being connected as one human family. When we don't do that, when we don't use the core human values of compassion and love, interdependence, we can end up being very brutal towards each other. I also want to call in and thank those of you who are younger in the room. You might not know it, and even though we complain about you all for multiple reasons, you're changing the culture in a good way. You're asking, what is gender? What does it mean? You're more tolerant. And you're asking us to care for the earth. We haven't been doing a good job. So I want to welcome everyone. I know we have multiple identities and we stay there, but I hope we can expand. And so I'm going to use as my reference point the African-American struggle, but I acknowledge that there are multiple struggles around the world. And hopefully we're aiming towards wanting to be a more connected and a more loving human family. And I must say, I love the word verdant. And as I got off the plane, I kept thinking, what a verdant place. You know, those of us in the desert of LA, sometimes it's a little brown, as is New Orleans. So please enjoy what nature has given. I can't compete with her tonight. No way, but so I'm very grateful that those of you who chose to be here came. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about healing justice. And as I'm focusing primarily on the African-American child and family and condition, I could easily, with some of the work I do in New Mexico, talk about newcomers, primarily from Latin populations, but I'm staying in the story that is the one that I am from, but please, if anything is translatable to other groups, please do so. So my framework is one of healing justice, and I'm just gonna read what it is a framework that recognizes the impact of trauma and violence on individuals and communities and names collective processes that can help heal and transform these forces. When I work with children living in poverty, children with histories of migration, children of various racial groups, I can't, as a physician, I can't just see their individual behaviors and think that I'm healing. I have to see the large context of the world in which they live and use that to guide me to ultimately help them to heal their individual selves. And as you know, children live with families and families are in communities. So the healing of the child somehow needs to, at least in my mind, somewhat be contiguous with trying to work for families to have better supports and the communities in which they have to have more access to resource and power. I can't do all of it, and this is why I align myself with multiple forces in the world, multiple people, institutions that are really working for the liberation of those of us who are oppressed. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about racial, a little history that explains some of the racial trauma that we've been carrying with us as African Americans. I'm going to talk a little bit about healthy development and attachment, because at the end of the day, no matter what's happening in the external world, we want to build strong families, strong children. I know you all know about ACEs. I'm going to skip through that. And then I'm going to hopefully spend most of the time on how we think about healing in our populations. Before I start, just want to invite us into the room. Just a moment to drop into your bodies. As I say, this is difficult for me. It's painful. Every time I do a lecture like this, or I read or see what's happening in the world, I feel the pain. So it's really important, I think, for us to just feel. So much of it is embodied. So wherever you are, whatever your body is doing, just be aware of it, your breath, anywhere in your body that feels tense. And if there's anything that I say that's painful or difficult, please connect to your breath, breathe. The peoples whose experiences I'm describing, it was in the past, and somehow generations of us have made it through. We've been resilient enough. So I invite you, in addition to just some mindful presence and paying attention to not just what you're thinking and feeling, but the sensations in your body, to go on this journey with me. This is where it started for us, the slave trade. Multiple centuries of being stripped and made to be or treated as if we were less than human. If any of you go to New Orleans, please go to the Whitney Plantation. It's the only plantation that tells the story of the slaves. You're not going to see Gone with the Wind. You're going to see the suffering of the slaves, and particular children. It's dedicated to children who were enslaved. We know about putting people as convict leasing, which is basically a continuation of slavery. Because you can see that people were shackled, as were children. And for those of you who might not want to see anything with lynching, close your eyes, because I can't remember if it's coming up next. Yeah. So I'm focusing on children. I'm focusing on the suffering. I want to remind you of Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice. Why is this important today? A month ago, someone on my staff called desperate. Her son was shaken. He's a 16-year-old African-American, very middle-class family. He got stopped by the cops. They pulled him up, they put his hands up, and my friend, my staff member is on the phone, her son, she's afraid, she doesn't know what to tell him. Don't move, don't make it seem as if you have something. And she got there and her son was surrounded by cop cars. He was just speeding, a 16-year-old speeding. I know my friend almost died. The thought that her son would have been killed. So these things are important when you bring a Black child or a Black family or any other family who experiences oppression. These are the experiences that we live. I told her to go home. There's no way she could work that day. And we got her son, he couldn't drive for about 2 weeks afterwards. He could not go near a car. This is the reality. These are some of the kids you're seeing. So we need to remember some of this. And I think this is when you might want to close your eyes. No, here's Trayvon. Don't forget him when you see a little Black boy in your office. Tamir, just playing with his toy gun. No one knew that would be the end of his life. I think I get to Emmett right now. So again, for those who need to close their eyes, yeah. And this is from whence it comes. Notice the party and the joy as men are dying. And of course, we witness George Floyd. He suffered 9 minutes, 49 seconds. Seeing the life, feeling the life leave him. This is our reality, y'all. I can't make it pretty, but what we can do is come together and try to figure out how to help from a healing justice frame, those of us who suffer this experience daily. When my coworker called me, I started crying. It was as if I was back looking at George Floyd. So what Fanon said, I don't know, anyone has read Fanon? Black Skins, White Mask, The Wretched of the Earth. He said that Black people's contact with the white man was traumatic. The very experience, being made to be 3/5 human, and how our body has been biologically racialized by white supremacists. He said this some 70 years ago. Nothing has changed. And so we could have spent the whole night talking about these episodes. We won't. But I just want to set the stage for you that we, as African Americans and other groups who are minoritized and oppressed, we really experience what has been used in other constructs to talk about collective trauma. And in there, I'm not going to go deep into Carl Jung, but what happens in the collective unconscious of those of us who've been traumatized, what kind of archetypes we carry of pain that at times we don't even know guide our lives. Again, we now have all the science that says that trauma impacts us biologically. It gets under our skin, the intergenerational transmission, traumatized women who are experiencing major trauma. And they've done studies with the Holocaust, with 9/11, and most recently Superstorm Sandy, that the offspring of women who are pregnant during these disasters are more vulnerable to mental health conditions, because we know there are epigenetic changes that can happen as genes, the proteins that are produced are somewhat modified based on the environment and to some extent behaviors. We know about allostatic loading, the difficulty of the body to recreate homeostasis when there's an insult, when there's stress. There's evidence, the only real study that was done in New Orleans post-Katrina that showed some of these biologic changes were looking at telomere length in women who had high ACEs, and we think some of it was a result of the natural disaster. It was found that their children at around 18 months were more likely to be showing externalizing irritable behaviors. These are mothers who had high rates of adversities in their lives. And again, we know the construct of weathering. So stress gets into our body. I don't think I have to explain that to you all either. Some of the popular books, when the body keeps the score. There's the other one about grandmother. I'm blocking the name of it, but we know what happens in the brain. We know the dysregulation in the amygdala, what senses threats to the environment, in the environment that our brain responds to. And then there's the psychic injury, what we pass on, the inherited traumas, mother, father, siblings. I put this picture here of a Jamaican woman who married a German, and the pain of her upbringing and the violence in his upbringing created a terrible, terrible impact on her and the children. They've all needed mental health care. So we carry the pain generationally, biologically, and can pass it on to our siblings. We also pass it on in the stories or the things we don't tell them or the ways we behave with our children. And again, getting back to what happens in the brain, because that becomes so important. When I do defense work for kids who are in the juvenile legal system. And everything about these kids is about amygdala that's hyperactive. The least sense of threat, they're ready to make sure that they're not caught off guard, and oftentimes become very, very prone to engage in very aggressive behaviors. So we know what's happening with the amygdala. It's hyperactive, it's overriding the prefrontal cortex that is much more regulatory and involved in the executive functioning of how we live our lives, how we plan, we reason, how flexible we are. We also know that this kind of toxic stress decreases our serotonin. Serotonin is very important for mood regulation. And we also know now more of the science is showing the decrease in oxytocin. I think everybody knows oxytocin, the love hormone, makes you feel good about others, helps with attachment. For people who carry histories of trauma or experiencing trauma, and if it's chronic and there are no buffers, poverty gives you no buffer. One of the last cases I defended, this is in Baton Rouge, and I saw the house that this family lived in. You're in this beautiful, verdant space. You can't imagine Southern poverty, whether urban or rural. It's pretty awful. So when we think about kids, Black and brown kids who for whatever reasons are experiencing traumas, I would like to think that we're getting past behavioral diagnoses. I don't want to get too clinical, but as a doctor, and I know whenever I give this talk, a lot of people, ADHD comes up. We're going to get rid of this diagnosis. It's unfair, because I know in my work, when I was on the streets in New Orleans after a major disaster, significant increases in the diagnosis of ADHD and prescriptions of amphetamines. That's what we use to treat it. No one took trauma histories. No one knew that the kids were up on top of McDonald's during the storm. No one paid attention to that they saw people die. Their behaviors are dysregulated. Let's slap them with Adderall. That's very unfair. And I tell my doctors I'm training, that's malpractice. If you've not taken a trauma history from a kid, especially if they're Black and brown, and you give them a diagnosis, a conduct disorder, a positional disorder, ADHD, that's malpractice. It is it's more preferable, and I don't know where you all are here with developmental trauma disorder, but if we were to use that construct, it would really address the brain impairment, the full range of dysregulation in the brain that happens with children who are experiencing chronic traumas. So it addresses the emotional dysregulation, the unmodulated aggression that exists, the poor attention. It addresses the difficulty kids have negotiating their own sense of who they are and their social relationships. And it also addresses the dissociation that can happen with trauma. I hope that the DSM-6 will shift over, because we have harmed so many children. Why do we have a opioid crisis? We've trained a whole generation that if you have some psych discomfort, turn to drugs that make you feel good. Of course we want to feel better. But sometimes in that feeling better, one could really harm themselves. I am now seeing generation, and this happens a lot because African-American males are overdiagnosed with ADHD. They're put on Adderall. And if you're poor, we have a little carrot with it. In some states, people call it a crazy check. If you have a kid with a diagnosis, he can get some money. So here are poor people with no money, and you give them a diagnosis, they get $200 a month. You think they're going to challenge the doctor? No, they're not. These kids then, and I've had a couple come to me, they know whether or not it's true, they think they have adult ADHD and they want amphetamines. That's what we've done. If indeed the cause of the dysregulation was trauma, because we'd have gone in a totally different direction if we'd made a trauma diagnosis. And when we do behavioral conduct disorders and oppositional disorder, you slap that on the kid. The schools know that diagnosis. And the first time the child looks uncomfortable, does something that's a little challenging, they call them in the South the dean of culture, when really that's the person who probably might call the cops to get the child into juvie. This is what we're doing, and it's considered standard practice. What did Dr. Filita say? That traumatic events of the earliest years of infancy and childhood are not lost, but like a child's footprint in wet cement, are often preserved lifelong. Time does not heal the wounds that occur in those years. Time conceals them. They're not lost, they are embedded. I've worked on death row in several Eastern states. And every person I saw who ended up with such aggressive behaviors, this is their story. Extreme traumas. I had one man, when his father came back from Vietnam, and whatever happened, thought that his son was gay. His 7-year-old son, he thought was gay. And he used to take him and hit him across the room. I saw the hospital record, 6 months on Pete's wards with fractures. No one paid attention. And so they paid attention when they were trying to kill him and asked me to come in to, no one along the way would pay for a doctor to really work with the kids like this. The Medicaid system, you get paid anywhere between $5 to $50. But when you have committed a murder, you pay the psychiatrist $300 to $700. Where were we when that child needed us? And then the unfortunate situation with the victim of these behaviors. So we have to do a radical rethinking of our society. So what shall I tell my Black child? I've shared with you our history. It's all been, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, it becomes embodied in us. Dr. Chester Pierce, one of the revered Black psychiatrists of the 70s, 80s, he did a study outside of Bloomingdale's, New York. Any New Yorkers? Darn. I love Bloomingdale's at 59th and Lex. He did a study there, and Black people, if Black people were coming out and white people were advancing, the white people didn't move. And there was always the Black person who moved out of the way and held their head down. It's very embodied in us. So for those of you, I just have this poem up there. Please read it. What shall I tell my Black child? How proud I will make them of who they really are. That's what we're struggling with now. The crisis that I see in minoritized children, they don't feel they belong, they don't feel they matter, they don't feel that they have any brilliance. So I will lift up their heads in proud Blackness with the story of their fathers and their fathers' fathers. and I shall take them into a way back time of kings and queens who ruled the Nile and measured the stars and discovered the laws of mathematics. Many of them don't know Socrates was Black. Many of them don't know Beethoven was Black. Many don't know I was in Barcelona. And do we know that it was a Moor who founded that amazingly beautiful city? And there's tons and tons. I'm at Charles Drew University. Charles R. Drew, who did all that work on plasma that eventually created labs and the various transfusions, who himself was denied treatment at a white hospital and died. Whatever happened in Atlanta. So in our roles, to me, we know all of this. We know there are these social determinants, these structural factors that are harming our children. I'm trying to, how do we protect a safe space where within the family system, in spite of it all, because that's why some of us are here, in spite of it all. So just a reminder how important it is as we lobby for children to lobby for their caregivers. And in particular, in those early years, we know the importance of oxytocin. It's what allows the mother to feel that social empathy and bonding and attachment. It creates all those biologic changes in her. And it happens to some extent in males, and in particular if the males are the primary caregiver. So whatever's happening to support maternal child health, whatever we want to call it, it's so important. And I can't but help whenever I travel to Europe, to the Scandinavian countries. I love to see how happy the children are. It's so different than if you went into an urban space, because there's all of this awareness and made into law of how important those early years are for a child in their bonding. That's where the child learns to be human. And it's aided in our species with oxytocin. And if we allow that to develop in a healthy way, where mothers are stressed out, there are mothers who sometimes, I went back to work 6 weeks after my babies were born, and I laugh at myself. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I stayed home 2 years with my kids. Well, once I tried to stay home with them, I had surgery, and I was home for 6 weeks. Around week 2, they said, "Mommy, could you go back to work?" So I said, okay, somehow in this craziness, something happened. They're okay. Because about 2 weeks with me at home, they felt we're better on our own and with our nannies, so go back to work. So we need to be thinking about and supporting efforts, and this is happening in many states now, paid family leave. All of these things are important when we're working in our communities. We have to support that. Minimum, all of that is important. And unfortunately, many times we don't talk about, we talk about poor people and we think it's welfare. Not. Oftentimes poverty happens more in working families. They're not earning enough. So please agitate, advocate, do whatever you can. If you think you want to support the well-being of children, you have to support the capacity of that early bonding. Just teaching attachment is not enough. It needs to be real. There needs to be some freedom within that caregiving space for healthy attachment to happen. And that usually comes with some economic freedom. So of course, to make up for my guilt for not being with my kids all the time. As you know, you read, every time I do child development stuff, I went, oh God, I failed at this. I use pictures of them in my lectures. But we know that it's really important for us to support that. And please, you all can interrupt, because I know this is the work that you do. And I would love for us to have a conversation about, other than just the direct work with families, what are some of the other determinants to that period that you think is important to support? And why is this important? Because it's what helps. That attachment is within that bond. That child is going to discover themselves. They're going to discover their mind. They're going to discover how they feel, how they think, put it together. They're going to know that there are safe spaces for them. They can trust the world. And they learn better to regulate their stress. And why this is important, I work with kids in the juvenile legal system. They don't know their emotions. They only know one. It's anger. They don't know fear. They don't know sadness. It was never labeled for them. No one taught them, oh, you're behaving like this. You're crying and having a temper tantrum because you're sad. They don't understand how their mind works. And so when we work with these young adults, it's not enough to teach them to just, so I'm going to challenge CBT and all these cognitive-based stuff. And I know there's some psychologists in here, you're going to kill me. And I'll tell you why. If we cannot connect our thoughts to the feelings that arise, because we know that we understand our world through our feelings, not through our thoughts. That's how the brain and the mind works. The mind is just reflecting the brain's survival mechanisms, what's happening internally to create homeostasis, and what's in the environment and how can the needs be met. Our kids who've experienced this kind of toxicity and suffering, they don't even know what they're feeling. They don't know their feelings. So I find it funny that all hip hop things is about, I'm in my feelings, and everybody's in their feelings. Drake is #1 in his feelings. But they don't know what they think, that feelings are odd. So if you get into your feelings, oh my God. And I usually say to them, I hear this a lot from the young people where I work. You're supposed to be in your feelings. It shouldn't be when you hear a hip hop song or when you get angry. So please, in the work that you do with children and grown children, do you use that word, transitional age children, they really don't know their feelings because they're longer along the path. And again, all they really know is just one feeling system, that of threat, and you respond with anger. So this attachment, if we can allow that, and families can be comfortable enough to be present with their kids, that is where they learn to understand themselves, the connection between their thoughts, their behaviors, and their moves. We know that when this, the first trauma that a child can experience is in that attachment space. And again, I'm assuming that you all know the Mary Ainsworth work, Bowlby's work, so I'm not going to stay there, but just a reminder, because what I don't understand, we know these things and we create therapies that don't respond. Most of the children that I see, their first trauma happened in that space. Caregivers who are substance using, whatever the environment is, we know about the ACEs, the neglect or abuse. Usually if that's happening, attachment issues perhaps precluded some of those experiences. And so when there is attachment trauma, then the child does not have the skills to mentalize. They cannot mirror themselves or others. So when you ask them, why did you hurt someone? I don't know. They're hurting all the time. They don't know what that is. And their acting out is just an externalization of what they're feeling. They don't know how to modulate their emotions, and they can't cope. So please, again, when you work with children, minoritized kids, they need a lot of time and attention. They're the ones who get the least time in the healthcare system. They have the most complex problems, and they have the least qualified to treat them, whether it's about their culture or just their skills. And then they end up in the carceral system. I know you all know about ACEs, so I'm just gonna, everybody, yes, right? Yeah, just gonna remind us that many of our kids, many of the kids I see, they're at between 4 and 6. Do you use the expanded ACEs, the Philadelphia version? Great. So again, accounting for the communities that have been destroyed, disinvested in. And so in these communities, there's violence. There is the racism that's so constant that these kids don't even know what that is anymore. They constantly feel unsafe. And I invite you all, have you had Dorothy Roberts torn apart to come talk here yet? You should invite her. The experience of the child welfare system and foster care system is very destructive to African-American families. It's almost was set up to destroy us. So when sometimes we think we're doing a good thing, it might not be so good. We're tearing apart families, and we're not providing the supports they need. And of course, in California, the first Surgeon General was very focused on ACEs and did all that amazing work. Nadine Burks-Harris, where now pediatricians are incentivized to screen, treat, and heal families, Medi-Cal pays for those screening and for whatever referrals they need. And this screening also addresses food insecurity and housing instability. And we know why unfortunately, the study, the Sentinel ACE study, was done in very middle-class white families. So it's not that applicable to all the experiences that non-white educated families have. It's where the studies show the connection between that level of adversity and brain dysregulation, mental health conditions, and physical conditions. But Dr. Filiti was asked that. I was at a lecture, I don't know if you've had him here, and someone asked him about that. And he said, well, if it's that bad in white people, it's going to be worse in your community. So, and he was saying it tongue in cheek, but he really meant it. It's like, we don't need to repeat the study. If there are this amount of buffers and we still see white middle-class families experiencing this amount of adversity, then you can imagine it's just as bad. I see my time is coming short. Just some pictures of our communities. This is New Orleans on any given day. These are sad children. They're not bad. We mounted a public will campaign in New Orleans with that hashtag, sad not bad, or kids' hearts are broken. We have a broken system, we've not cared for them. And so how do they get to being mentally healthy? And I just have up here WHO's definition of mental health is when one can realize one's own abilities, cope with the stresses of life, can be productive, and can make a contribution to the community. So many kids, this has been blocked. not because they did anything other than they were born in families experiencing oppression. And so we know how important it is, and I'll be finished in about 5 to 10 minutes, for caregivers to be healthy enough so that they can help. We talked earlier about the need to help a kid to mentalize, but to help bind the anxiety. It's hard being thrown out here as a little child when you know that if you don't, and many of the child theorists have talked about this, the recognition that you're so dependent, and how do you work with this human being who, if they don't attend to your needs, your survival mechanisms know that you will die. We know it's healthy caregivers who try to encourage curiosity and the desire to learn, sets limits. When families are ground down by poverty, it's hard. They're in survival mode. I saw that in New Orleans after Katrina, and you see it in any poor community. I see it in New Mexico, I see it in LA. Poverty grinds people down in a capitalist society. I grew up poor in Jamaica, but I never necessarily felt that way. I had the beautiful verdant spaces and oceans, and I didn't know what poverty was. I had food, you know, so it's a whole different construct in areas of the world, but certainly in the US, it's grinding. I saw where my patient lived, his house in Baton Rouge, and I cried. I couldn't believe there's still outhouses. They still exist. They don't, oftentimes they don't have electricity. So how are we going to get this when the parents are struggling? And so either they go have jobs, or they don't have jobs, or they use drugs. And usually when they go off and get jobs, they don't have money to, I could have a nanny. They don't have nannies. They're paying for childcare, takes about 1/3 of single mother's salary. So we have to advocate for those things. And we have to advocate for families to be able to care, have experiences. I was saying earlier on that I went to Jazz Fest. I saw these beautiful Black jazz performers all over, and I wondered, what would the world be like if the kids that are in the juvenile carceral system had had music education? Some of them would have been up on that stage taking us. I mean, it's amazing to see, you know, where you're in a tent and there are 500 people and Terence Blanchard or one of the Marsales, and everybody goes off in a whirl with them and lose themselves. Many of these kids could have been that. So we need our communities to support mental hygiene. We need nature. Kids need nature. They need to learn to be told the stories of their ancestors. And most importantly, they need to sleep. The kids are not sleeping, y'all. They're up on their little machines. Their parents are equally distracted. Someone asked me, what do you tell parents about social media usage? I say, tell them to think about their own social media usage, because older people are equally on social media as our children. And children pattern. My little grandson, he can swipe that stuff in, oh, he's good. When they were about 2 or 3, they were ordering things on Amazon because their parents are doing that. So yeah, we have to help kids find sleep again. It's, you all know how important it is for brain health, for restoration. And I just wanted, one day I was walking through the park in New Orleans, and I saw this amazing family. It almost seemed like one of those photographs that you see of Gordon Parks' photograph. We need for there be spaces for children to play and to be around kin, not just their nuclear family. And a lot now I see an uptake in New Orleans, and I was recently in London, and there's some groups doing it. This project out of Zimbabwe called the Grandparent Project, where grandparents are kind of sitting, yay for grandparents, whereas I need to be sitting on a stool And just talking to, that intergenerational exchange is so important. We need to create those spaces if we want to have mentally healthy kids. And I always put this picture up because these kids, they're my Katrina babies. Their principal called me and she said, Dr. Shervington, I don't know what to do. I figured out that their mothers were pregnant. They were in 3rd grade at the time, during Katrina, and the kids are off the hook. Can you help me? I said, I'll give it a try. So what did I do? I suited up with my CBITS book and I took the social worker. I'm going to teach you how to do this. The kids were like playing. They didn't want to do that. They wanted me to be present with them, not with a manual. They wanted to feel me. I asked the principal, is it okay? She said, please do. Of course, there are boundaries, so be real clear when I say feel me. But they wanted to sit on my lap. And that's how they wanted to tell their stories. And there was a young girl, one of them in here, I won't identify her. She saw, and they all said I could use, the great thing about the young people, they're so narcissistic, you can always use their pictures. They love it. Maybe they'll become Instagram influencers, I don't know. But one day, one of these kids, she came and she rested her head on my shoulder. And she said, I'm having bad dreams. I would have never gotten this with the CBITS book, I'm telling you. And her story is, she and her mom were at a Church's Fried Chicken, and something went wrong her grandmother, something went wrong in the exchange with somebody trying to sell something, and grandmother shot and murdered this guy in front of her. She was about 5 or 6. And grandmother, I guess in her fear, ran away and left her and her brother with the dead body in front of the Church's Chicken. It's in the newspaper. And so, yeah, she goes to school and she can't concentrate. And so she came and she sat next to me and she curled up her head. And she said, Dr. Shervington, I had a really bad nightmare with my grandmother that she's dying. This was also the kid. We would think, I saw them weekly. You'd think you're doing good. And I never could figure out what the cues were for her. And she would lose it. Lucky we could contain her in that space. By the end of 3rd grade, they'd all settled in. They all made it through 3rd grade. And I feel one of the proudest bit of work I've done because the kids taught me how to help them. And I went with my arrogance thinking, I have all of this preparation. No, they wanted, when they came in the session, if they wanted to, sometimes they'd say, let's do yoga. And they had their little yoga mats and we did yoga. They would laugh at me, they'd bring their music in. I learned a lot of hip hop during that time. They would bring the music in, but within 3 months, the principal said, they're doing so much better. Okay. So we need schools that are not punitive. And this was the principal. I love her so much. She just got her PhD from Harvard, and I know she's going to do amazing work in that space. She called me, she said, come help me with these kids. Schools in poor neighborhoods, I don't know what happens here. They're like mini prisons. I would go in to observe, and kindergartners and 1st grades, their eyes had to track the teacher. They had little lanes they could be in. They can't speak at lunchtime, and they can only speak when the teacher acknowledges them. That's not developmentally appropriate. They should be rolling around, curious, feeling their world, touching. This is what we're doing with our kids. And they need to learn their history. Your history actually is part of your liberation. Our kids are restless, they don't feel safe, they can't rest. They don't feel that their communities can hold them. And we all know, those of us who have succeeding in life. That's what we look for where we live, spaces that can hold us. So we have our nice little yoga studios and coffee shops and all those nice things. They actually hold you and make you feel better. Many of the kids we work with don't have that. Why shouldn't they have that? In this Sad Not Bad campaign, and then I'm really going to end, they, right in front of the jail, I had this billboard up, because I've done enough work on death row. And I feel I can say that all the men that I worked with, and I just didn't work in women's prisons for no reason other than I got called to these spaces. The untreated extreme traumas, usually physical abuse, a lot of physical abuse in the death row space. And so whenever I would see the sheriff, we walk in the same park, he would say, when are you going to get that billboard down? I say, until you go out of business. And we give young people, because, you know, these were usually young men in that jail. We give them the mental health care they need in addition to fixing their communities and changing and making a more harmonious society. And so I just want to end with how we come together to co-create and re-envision, as different as we are, a better world. America is full of multiple people with multiple identities. But we can create healthier communities if we can see each other. Borrow from Fanon, who said, ended black skin's white mask with superiority, inferiority. Why not simply try to touch the other, feel the other, discover each other? These are the spaces where we're going to, if we can imagine a world where we see each other and move beyond our identities because we feel sufficiently validated in them. I'm not asking anyone to jump their identity, but to be solid in it so that you can see beyond it. Then I think we can envision and create a healthier world where our children can heal. And I'm going to try, I've did the little thing. I say I'm a doctor, you're going to expect me to talk about trauma therapy. You all know that. I want to focus a little bit on the importance, two things I've found extremely important. Teaching kids about their brains dysregulated, they actually will get it. I also found during the height of the HIV epidemic and we were doing prevention work, I once had a kid tell me back about mRNA, reverse transcriptase, and say, see, they all told me that I couldn't go in there with a lesson on the biology and teach the kids about how the virus works. They got it. So you can teach them about their brains, let them know what's happening. I try to tell them what their mind is, how the mind is just reflecting the activity in the brain. They get it. And very important, the teaching them to relax their bodies. And I know there are multiple ways this can be done, simply, you know, lean against the wall. The kids used to tell me at the school, whenever they say, can we do yoga? I knew they were feeling tense. That's really, really important. And then you all know how to do the rest. And then they're my kids again, my Katrina babies. I love them, I love them, I love them. They were great. And I wish I could play this for you all. Did you see? Here we go. So in all of this, I've talked about the pain, the sorrow. Every December, I go see Alvin Ailey, and they got a new piece for young people. It's called, Are You in Your Feelings? I think that is so cute. And it's very young, and they're doing all the dances. And I want to end you with a classic. This is how many of us survived. Music, dance. And I want to share that with you. The kids do it differently, but this is the base. Okay, so I want to thank you all. My references, all that stuff. see if you have any questions, but I end with that because every time I see these beautiful Black bodies, I think about those we've locked up, thrown away, didn't give these opportunities, didn't give them the music, didn't give them the creative outlets for their pain. Negro spirituals, and I love Alvin Ailey for doing this. And now I forget the name of the new choreographer who did in Are You in Your Feelings, but it helps us to transcend and move out of the pain and find joy and connect. And this is what our children need. So I hope that if I imparted nothing, is that let's try love on, let's try compassion, and let's try to get our kids more deeply understanding their feelings, getting in touch with whatever creative outlets they are, feeling connected to this mystery that none of us really understand, and feeling that they have a place and they have value and they can be whomever they want to be, or whomever they came here to be. They didn't come here to be locked up or to commit the kind of crimes that got them where they are. So thank you very much, and I'll entertain questions.
I'm a teacher.
Oh, okay.
In middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So I'm really with that high energy group of young people. But I've said many times, and you reiterated that doing something for the child is not enough. You've got to reach far beyond that and get to that family and that environment that they go back into every single day is where they're being trained. You know, we do our best, but yeah, parents need a lot of help. I guess it's what I say. But that focus on at least in my realm of being in school, reaching the child, and also that.
Spot on, Dennis. And thanks for saying that teachers, you play such an important role. Everybody that I've worked with who came out of these circumstances as it was a teacher. Some teachers saw something, but the kids who are living in these conditions, it was a you who said, you have value, you have worth. Tell me what's going on. Not labeling that kid as bad. So please continue to do that. I know you've changed so many people's lives. The football players, we just had a group come out of New Orleans, which I guess they did the whole Pythagoras theorem thing. Teachers, you're also, you're one of the groups we treat with the least value. Part of this should be advocating for that. I want teachers and pilots, pilot training. Our nurses. So traditional jobs for women have always not been highly valued. But without you, it's compassion. I don't know if it was the Dalai Lama, someone said that it's a compassionate act to teach someone. I think it's better, to teach someone to read and write. That's an act of compassion and love. So please keep knowing how important you are to our children. Every success story out of the projects, and I'm saying project specifically, was a teacher helped me. I have tons of them. A teacher saw me.
Specifically special education teacher. And so the ADHD tag is prevalent. And so it's nice to hear we're misdiagnosing many of these kids.
Yes, we are. ADHD is diagnosed 9 times more in Black males than any other group. They don't have ADHD, I'm gone. And then some of them, we put them on Cerebrel. I have gone to the classroom and the kid is like this, because they're on cerebral. So, you know, we're zonking the child out because we don't know how to manage them. And one kid, thinking the situation got so bad, parents were strong. Grandfather, this was right after Katrina went and got kid. But grandpa didn't know how to take care of kids. They go to school dirty, very little food. Teachers are so amazing, they'll carry tea books and kids, all that kind of stuff. But the doctors put the child was on 200 milligrams. I don't give that to adults unless they have this respectful. So yeah, I could do a whole thing on ADHD. I go head to head with anyone who's telling me about ADHD. Because until you have done the trauma diagnosis, I don't get that back. Because of course the brain is dysregulated. That's the amygdala, it looks like amygdala dysregulation from trauma looks like ADHD. Classic symptoms, attention, hyperactivity.
Loss of sleep. So a lot of these kids aren't sleeping. Yeah.
Some of them are really scared, they don't tell you, but they're scared to sleep because of guns. And we think we're going to get this grant with UCLA. In addition to gun noise in South LA, it deliberately was decided by the government to have helicopters fly over. And so there's that study that's coming out that shows that helicopters disproportionately fly low in areas in Los Angeles and the sleep disturbance that it causes. Housing is
But I also think about the broader environment that we're in and I don't know, the sort of like hard, unpredictable white supremacist environment that we're in. And I don't know, with the sort of approach we're sort of wanting to equip the child instills these like behaviors that are almost maladaptive for their survival in the midst of this white supremacist environment. Not very useful for, a Black child, a Black family to, have that same white cultural capital in this environment. And immediately it's almost like a giving up of themselves. So I'm curious, how do we sort of leverage, the ways in which these families, these young folks are resisting and surviving in the midst of this ongoing oppression. Yeah.
Well, in the South, maybe why I don't want to forget lynching. I remember when Obama won, and I was in the elevator, and an old Black man was crying. He was like, he worked in the same building, he was in his 80s. And he said he remembered growing up in New Orleans during the lynching period. Word would go out, and all the males were held in. If they didn't go outside, they would get the word that the lynch mob was coming, and they'd all go hide inside. And so when we could not imagine a Black president, we've always held our kids in. Martha Ward did some studies, anthropological studies, of how at this period when kids should be exploring the world, Black families pull them in. The classic Eddie Murphy thing in the supermarket, where the white kids are tearing up the supermarket and filling up the cereal box. And the Black family mother looks at the child, that look, you better get your, yeah, and sometimes I do. I remember when I was in Beijing, children explored because a little unknown in the restaurant when they were all older, but the world was their way. Not so Black. So I understand what you're saying. I mean, like workaholic son, you know, he had it, I think he had his mother's Land Rover and he was just chilling in it and he was driving a little too fast. In a split second, when he called and said, "Your cops have stopped me," she started telling him what he needed to do. Nothing has changed. So it's a dance. It's a dance between the freedoms of just being free, versus you could be a target. I mean, in New Orleans, in Baton Rouge, or even the killing out of Sterling in Baton Rouge after getting the guy in New York selling bootses. They were just kind of doing what people do to spread. So, yeah, we containment versus freedom. We've always been fighting for liberation. And I feel when we were liberated, everyone was liberated. Stand with this way. And what's exciting to me is that young people of all races and class, they want to do something better for the earth. And I think once you stand and you respect the earth, it's more likely that you're going to respect the people on the earth. So I'm hopeful that I'm hopeful in the young people started with Parkland and they got out there and they said enough. And even though as adults we've squelched them, they're going to change the world. I have to do that. Otherwise, I think we're on the thing that was such a beautiful place. So thanks.
Once again, join me in thanking Dr. Shervington.